Okay, so this is the panel on bureaucracy. I'm with Barrientos, the moderator here. I had spent about 26 years in government, and I think this panel is going to be a little bit contrary. We're not going to try to emphasize the horrors we have experienced on either side, but sort of ways in which bureaucracy is helpful, and also talk about in writing some of the realistic ways to depict it. In my years in government, I was noticing, among other things, that where I was when I need to get a particular thing done, there were just two of us, me and my supervisor that signed it, and the supervisor above me. And that was it, because basically on the government end, there was only so much problems that we could create as long as everything was legal. While meanwhile, when we were signing off on someone in the public sector, they could be losing millions of dollars there. But as long as all legal on our end, that wasn't our problem. Meanwhile, my wife had been in contracting, so where she was, in a relatively small company, they had about 5 signatures on documents, including one of the chief executives, because basically if they make a mistake, it's all the way up, and the company could lose money on that. So that's kind of interesting, even though there were probably more negative ramifications where I was, not where I was working with the people I was with. There were fewer signatures needed. So let me just pass on to other people here. Well, let's go to Jean Marie.
Hi there. My name is Jean Marie Ward. I write fiction, nonfiction, and everything in between. And for my sins, I worked for the government for 29 years, most of it in the Department of Defense. And I've got stories good and bad. And basically, I can tell you how you can work all that into your writing, if that's what you're interested in, without getting sued or indicted.
Okay. Let's see, Monica, you wanna?
Okay, I just realized I didn't know where my microphone was in relation to my face. I was like, oh, where is that? I have experience in both the municipal county level government as a public librarian, and also a little bit of the federal side of things in the DC public library system. And I'm pretty well versed with the headaches of the approvals. I am a freelance editor and translator, so I do editing for Quasar editing, and then also for the Dread Machine, where I'm an acquiring editor. And I do translation stuff on the side, Spanish to English and vice versa. And one of my translations appeared earlier this year in Constellation magazine. And I have a dog on my lap, so if there's suddenly barking or a dog appears, that's why.
Doc?
Hi there, I'm Doc Coleman. I'm a steampunk author, and I'm also a veteran of over 32 years of government service. And I've, over the years, I have gone from dreading and hating paperwork to understanding why we have it. And as it's been said, that we often hear that all the horror stories, but there are some very good reasons why you need to build a certain amount of bureaucracy into your world building. And it's also good for a comedic scene or 3.
Okay, Beth.
I'm Beth Morris Tanner. I am a writer and a fan, and I have been in state and federal government for the last decade. And before that, I was in nonprofit organizations, which are similarly bureaucratic. And I agree heavily that it's not all terrible, and that we should bring some amount of bureaucracy in just to answer questions that your readers may have and that your characters may have, and that can also set up some interesting situations for your characters dealing with bureaucracy, and they don't have to be horror stories. Mm-hmm. And I too am inhabited by cats, so there will doubtless be another cat appearance at some point.
Okay, so I guess what would be in your experience, either something that you can cite that is a book or a movie or television that does bureaucracy well in your opinion? And if not, if you want to give some examples of what you think should be in there that you may have suggested to our writing or anything else.
I'll jump in real fast. I think if anyone has seen the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy movie, the section about Vogon paperwork, and like if you want a form sign in triplicate and it gets lost, like there's a clip of it somewhere on YouTube, I'm sure. It's hilarious and completely sums up the ridiculousness that of needing to get something approved in any government situation.
Mm-hmm.
Or where the Vogon plans were on display.
Yeah.
In a locked filing cabinet in disused laboratory. Yeah.
With the sign on the door that says "Beware of the leopard."
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Mhm. Well, my favorite, other than Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, is Charlie Strauss's laundry files. He worked in the National Health System in Britain, and I didn't realize it because they weren't mentioning it in his blurbs and data, you know, because that one paragraph blurb, they talk about your writing and your, but I interviewed him and I said, my goodness, you really nailed bureaucracy. And he gave me this look, I should have. National Health Service. And you know, he doesn't sound like that normally. It was like everything went.
Let's see. The example that I would point to is actually the TV show MASH, and particularly the character of Radar O'Reilly, because this was a person who understood all the paperwork and everything you had to do to get things done, whether or not anybody else did. And you also get some great lines there. So like, you know, we don't do anything around here with the 227 stroke J. We don't go to the bathroom without a 227 stroke J. And that's not just because we're running out of toilet paper. But that's an excellent example of how an efficient bureaucrat gets things done. And also just extending that just a little bit, looking at both some of the episodes where Radar and later Klinger have to go and make trades in order to get necessary resources, also shows some of the interesting interactions that you have in a bureaucracy in order to try to convince someone else to do their job and send you the things that you've requested.
Okay. So what do you think in terms of writing is the most important thing to get in there in in depicting a bureaucracy? Is it the details that you have to go into about what things are, or or how it makes everything work, or what do you think? It's important to make it realistic.
I'll jump in again. One of the most important things is to have a bureaucracy and to understand that the primary driver of the bureaucracy is funding or goods and services. If you do not understand how that happens, your world is going to fall apart. My favorite bureaucracy story is I was invited to participate in another writer, best-selling writer's universe. And I said, you don't want me to participate in your universe because you have never worked in government and it shows. And he said, oh, no, you must participate. You must participate. I said, no, I will tear down your entire intelligence structure with one Freedom of Information Act request. And he said, oh, no, you can't possibly do that. I said, that's what I will do if you want me in this anthology. Okay. And I did. The story was the Ellsberg variations in lost signals, but it just goes to show that so many people send troops or other forces into space, or, you know, have the king tell somebody to go do something. And that doesn't work if you have to manage a wide-ranging country or a wide-ranging universe, because you don't, once you get to the point where you need to delegate to several levels to manage your work, to manage the work of the government, to manage the work of a company, to manage the work of a library system, you absolutely positively need bureaucracy. And so many people don't understand that in order to make their universe work, you need it. So that would be where I would go. You know, just the fact you need it, and then work from there.
If I can spin off of that, whenever you start trying to run any kind of large organization, be a business or a government, you start off with accounting, and accounting necessarily produces bureaucracy, because you start off with, you know, okay, well, we need pens for the office. So you start figuring out how many people we have, how many pens we have to get. And that adds up to a huge amount of money. So it's like, you spent $200,000 on pens? Where are they? Why can't I find a pen? And it's like, who approved this? Well, now you need bureaucracy, because you need the paper trail that said how you came up with this figure of how many pens you need, and why it cost $200,000, and why you couldn't get it cheaper from somewhere else. It's all about keeping track of everything and covering your butt.
And getting it from point A to the people who bought it, to the people who need it, which is its own bureaucracy.
Yep. But you asked about in world building, so or in writing, so that's a case of you have to figure out what role you want the bureaucracy to play. Is it background? Is it a force of nature that you have to fight against? Is it a chance for comedic relief? Or do you have, you know, a character or a small group of characters who are the epitome of efficient bureaucracy that you can't imagine how they get things done, but they just happen?
And then a miracle occurred.
Yep.
I think the other thing that it says, though, is sort of getting back to Jean Marie's point, what bureaucracy builds around tells us a lot about the world. So if the issue is really about pens, then that tells us, okay, we're a literate society that has these kinds of things that are important, and these kinds of things that are valued in the society, in the organization. If we are counting everything on abacus still, then that tells us something about our society and our organization. If our concerns are really about saving face as an organization, and we don't care what goes on behind the scenes as long as, you know, the right paperwork gets filed, then that's a different society and a different organization than if we are gonna barter about everything, and everything is an agreement and an arrangement between people. It's Klinger going to the other folks and saying, I really need a case of morphine to get those. You know, that gives us those little nuggets of world building without even having to build the whole bureaucracy. You just have to throw in enough to get it rolling. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess it's something you have to play by ear. I mean, I'm sure people went into writing not to write about bureaucracy. So what would you say is like a minimum amount of the background if they're really not interested in it as a writer? What would you think would be a minimum amount to get in there, to just know that these things exist even if you don't, as a writer, understand them?
Yeah, I feel like that you have to think about, like, as a writer going into your stories, like even if you're just like talking about like a market situation, either on a space station or like in a fantasy world, you have a market. So who governs that market? Like, what are the rules of like just doing business. There's a bureaucracy behind that, even if it's like a bribe or a black market bribe-based bureaucracy. There's a certain level of bureaucracy that comes with any economics and trade. And even if you're not gonna like really mention the government, or oh, there's a king in passing, or like something like that, you've got to think about like the bureaucratic, like there's like, even if you're not really explicitly thinking, oh, I'm going to think about the bureaucracy of my fish market, like there's also just like you're also just trying to figure out how things work and like what the rules are, and there's a bureaucracy to figuring out those rules, even if you aren't thinking of it or framing it in terms of like the government bureaucracy.
And you just reminded me of another excellent example, and that is Nathan Lowell's share series. Starts off with Quarter Share. It's a sci-fi series that follows one young man's progression as part of a merchant marine fleet, but the whole area is run by the Joint Committee on Trade and something, and they've standardized everything. And at first it seems like, well, this is kind of great. You always know the rules, everything just works. But as you get along into it, you realize how much people are getting ripped off. But it's a good example of storytelling where bureaucracy is there, but you're not paying attention to it. You're paying attention to what people are doing as they move through it.
Well, I think that brings up a really interesting point, though, is a lot of times you don't notice bureaucracy, or your characters don't need to notice bureaucracy until it breaks down. And it's the point when it breaks down that suddenly you realize, oh, that was important. You know, how many times have we seen, post-apocalyptic stories where all of a sudden the power grid is down, or the water system is down, and then now what do we do? Who's in charge of getting that back up and running?
So the novel that I'm working on, I initially, in my first draft, was a character's just adventuring this world, right? And as I went through edits and redrafting, I realized that the interesting story was actually the bureaucracy of the failing oligarchy that runs this world. And why is it failing? How is it failing? How does this affect everyday people who are caught up in like the petty meddling of the people running the oligarchy through the effects of the decision making that they have? And also there's a lot of forms that have to be signed. And I took a chapter to my writing group, and they were like, this was the most riveting chapter about a single piece of paper being signed that I've ever read. And I was like, I have achieved this. This is good. I have an achievement unlocked, but also just like when you start, like when you do a first draft of a story, you may not even look at it, but it's when you're doing the editing and you have you have a friend or a beta reader looking at your story, like, well, why does it work like this? What's the justification for this? That's when, like, at least for me, that's when the bureaucracy starts to be like, oh, I really need to flesh out this aspect of it, because I can't articulate or argue back enough about why what I'm trying to say makes sense, why it should happen this way.
And those kind of changes tend to be changes on changes on changes on changes. So you end up with really Byzantine processes because it started off as something simple and it's been tweaked slightly over the years. But the other thing I want to say is that one other aspect of bureaucracy is there is a process for everything. If you're dealing with a government or big organization, they have a process. It may not make sense, but they have one.
Yeah. It made sense somewhere at some point to someone, and it looked good on paper, and that's what mattered.
Yep.
Yeah, well, as somebody was saying in the chat, it's not so much the process itself, but the lines between the little blocks that make up the process. Mm-hmm. You can use, as we've all been saying, use bureaucracy for good or ill, but how effective you are in using it is frequently the result of the connections you have elsewhere in it. Because if you are laser focused on your little piece of paper that you're stamping, to cite Doc's example, the pens, making sure the pens are purchased and delivered, okay? Or maybe you just make sure the pens are purchased. If that's all you're doing, you're very powerless. You can block up the system, but you can't move it forward. But if you are the person between the pens getting ordered and the pens getting to where they need to go, people at both ends of that line are going to need you. You're a nexus. And you know that is what determines the power of the bureaucracy. Whether or not it needs to be explicitly stated in a story depends on the story. However, if you are trying to make something big, an empire, a federation, or whatever, and you don't recognize that this needs bureaucracy to function, you're going to have people like me coming up and saying, no, your world can't work like that, because I'm a pissy reader, I apologize. But if you're dealing with a very intimate story between, just to use, even in an epic fantasy world, if you are talking the interaction between an aristocrat and their servant, for example, you probably don't need to explicitly state your bureaucracy, because it will be implied in the fact that there is one person who's of a greater social status than the other, but it becomes a personal thing, not a organizational thing. But if you're doing a great, wide scope thing, like Rebecca Kwong's The Poppy War, you better believe there's going to be bureaucracy in that, and there should be. And she's very aware of this. But, on some stories, it's not going to matter. But when you get into that kind of scope, it's going to matter a lot.
Just to jump off your mentioning of the lines and the blocks, in addition to the people who are the lines being the ones who do things, those are also, as a writer, those are points where you can have conflict. Those are points where you can stir up problems and move your plot along or create obstacles for your characters when those people who are those lines between point A and point B, when something goes wrong there that the characters weren't expecting.
Yeah, the place where people go missing out of that, that matrix, or you can't figure out who the right person is to go to, or you got misdirected to the person. I was thinking a little bit earlier about Glory Road is generally a terrible novel in some ways, but the whole business about the fairy godmother department of the army,
I was just thinking of that.
That does or doesn't, get you things.
Yeah, you have the surprise party department and the fairy godmother
department.
Yep.
But it's very much the case that if you get directed to the wrong bureaucrat, you might end up there forever. And if you get directed to the right bureaucrat, then your path might end up being smooth.
And if you get directed to the wrong bureaucrat, you may also just get told no, when the proper one would have been like, oh yeah, we can totally do that and make that happen.
Oh yes. And what can get lost in bureaucracy if it goes to the wrong place? You filed the paperwork, it was diverted. I once knew a man whose application for a green card got held up 3 years because his last name was Smith. And his paperwork was attached to another Smith's paperwork in the wrong state.
Oh, Lord.
Not even the same first name or anything.
My husband's green card paperwork was returned because we had overpaid.
I love it.
They returned the whole package because we had overpaid.
Yeah, that's something else. I noticed in the chat some people have been talking about the military specs for fruitcake and things like that. And it's like, yeah, once you get into any kind of regulated military organization, once you want people to look at your soldiers and recognize them as your soldiers, now you have to have a bureaucracy to make sure that they all look alike. and have the right markings on them, and that requires money and administrators and all kinds of fun things. So even if you don't see it, it's behind the scenes in your world building.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You don't have to say it to know it's there. You don't have to know all the details of it. Hell, people who who work over on the hill have no idea what's going on in those funny buildings around them, but they know they're there and they know they're important. Damn it.
Okay, let's see if there's any questions in here.
Somebody in the chat has also mentioned like things like quality control.
Mm-hmm.
And that all evolves out of somebody somewhere thinking that they need to be in charge of something.
Or somebody somewhere having had something go horribly, horribly wrong.
Horribly wrong.
Yeah, talking about the fruitcake. The reason there are specifications, and there were specifications for the fruitcake, was because inferior goods were being sold to the US military. And so inferior that they spoiled before they got to the troops. Now, fruitcake, if I don't know, there are probably a lot of people in the audience who are too young to remember fruitcakes, but fruitcakes should be soaked in alcohol. Therefore, they last for a year. Frequently, they're soaked for months in alcohol. They last for a long effing time. I think it's like honey. You could dig one out of a Victorian tomb and still eat it. But the contractors were cheating on the product. They were not using butter or acceptable fats. They were not using the appropriate quality flour. Instead of putting in properly chopped fruits, they were leaving the pits in the candied cherries. Yeah, when something goes wrong, you need a reg.
And somebody else mentioned that the safety regulations are written in blood. Nobody comes up with this because they think it's a good idea. They come up with it because someone else got hurt.
Yeah.
Every
Somebody
time I
else got
see
hurt.
every time
Go
I see
ahead,
like a
Mom.
long list of rules, like you cannot do this, you may not wear these things, you may not, like every time you have something like that, it's like, okay, what were the circumstances that got like paper clips as jewelry banned from the office? Like, why did that get banned? So it's like,
What was Skippy doing?
Yeah. Yeah, it's just like, what happened, who got hurt, and how? Like, and you can write stories about that, just speculating off that stuff.
Yeah.
Every rule has somebody's name on it with and this is, in memory of Bob's stupid thing.
Yeah, there's a thing running through some of my friends on Facebook, hashtag there was an incident. And basically we end up putting that with some picture of some ridiculous warning, do not whatever. And the first thing you think was, who in the world would want to do that? You have to, there was an incident. So somewhere someone decided to do that. So.
And sometimes somebody thought it was a good idea, or at least fun.
I wanted to get back to the food safety thing for a second, because that's something, even if you're writing like a medieval-esque fantasy, that's been a problem since then. People short weighting bread, or mixing in sawdust, or mixing in, later in the Victorian and Edwardian period, it was mixing in plaster of Paris. And
or using infected flour.
Yeah, to sell things, and somebody figured out that, hey, there's either money to be made or safety to be had, and usually in that order, money and then safety, to get that, to solve those problems and build that body of regulation.
Okay, let's see, looking at some of the questions there. Any other humorous takes on bureaucracy that anyone might have in mind?
Well, Jean Marie said the laundry files. They are hilarious.
They are. They're wonderful. Well, to a certain extent, both, well, MASH and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy are comedies as well. Some things are just so pervasive, so big, and dealing with such monumental issues, if you don't make them comedy, it's too painful.
Yeah, you're just gonna sit and cry.
Yeah, I mean, that may be why, for example, military science fiction frequently ignores it. Simply because if you get into that and you're trying to be serious, people will just be broken entirely.
Well, it could be your could be your comic relief. I mean, that's what it was in MASH and the
Mhm.
terrible
And
death of
MASH
Coleman
was a
novels.
very accurate depiction of what was happening in the Korean War, because my father was a medical administrator there. I mean, bureaucracy runs in my family, it practically gallops. And all of his stories were about things like finding the one guy who could put together a latrine and actually get it to flush, only he was a bit of a rogue. So my father was protecting his engineer by somehow managing to find all of these weekend passes to Seoul every time he got into trouble. And I should also mention in this context that my father's only combat award, the Bronze Star, was for building a nurse's latrine.
I was thinking about which the Apollo mission where the contractors had built parts that didn't replace and didn't, interconnect appropriately.
So yeah, this Apollo 13, yeah, with the well, I mean, they didn't expect to use them that way, and I probably was cheaper to, build them with different different specs, and yeah, they didn't mean to use those oxygen scrubbers because they were never meant to be used together.
What was the one though where somebody was using metric and somebody was using Imperial, and then they ended up like completely the wrong shape and size?
Well, I think that was an unmanned Mars mission, I believe. That one of the contractors, I think most of them were using metric. One of the contractors was using English imperial measurements, and so everything was all wrong. And that I think that one just totally went off course, and they lost contact and all that other stuff. Yeah.
Somebody in chat says yes, they splatted the lander.
Yeah. When you start talking about things going wrong in a bureaucracy, if you have a dark sense of humor, then you can definitely milk that. Remember, there was a short story, and unfortunately, I can't remember who wrote it or what the title was, but it was started off with a notice going out to someone because his library book was overdue for the book Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. And over the course of the notices and responses and it getting routed to the wrong department, the end result is that the person ends up being arrested and executed for the kidnap and murder of Robert Louis Stevenson over 100 years before, because people just process the paperwork. They don't read it and understand it.
Yeah, reading those regs, reading the paperwork is a superpower in the government. You can do anything if you know your regs.
Like I said before, there's a process for everything. If you know your regs, you know the process, you can get it done.
You can find a reason to say yes or a reason to say no, probably in the same regulation.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, and you also know how to leapfrog over the little blocks if you know your regs.
As you guys were, I'm sorry, go ahead.
It can be fun, yes.
As you guys were talking, I was trying to remember, there's a game, I haven't played it, but it's been recommended to me. It's Papers, Please. And pulled up the Wikipedia because I was like, I know it has something to do with bureaucracy, and it describes itself as a dystopian document thriller, and you're an immigration checkpoint officer reviewing people's papers. And if I remember correctly, it's pretty hilarious, but I haven't played it yet from like all the way through. But that's one to consider. I don't really read a whole lot of like humor stuff, so I don't have many recommendations on that front. But on the game side, I enjoy the sassier bureaucracies.
Yeah,
So-
because I mean, Douglas Adams' Bureaucracy is one of the early ones in the genre.
And apparently, Danny in the audience has pointed out that the story I was referring to was Computers Don't Argue by Gordon R. Dixon, published in 1965. So thank you for recognizing the story and knowing what it was.
Yeah, well, the thing, the line between horror and humor is very thin. That you can frequently reverse in either direction. That think of something horrific and turn it into a humorous situation, and turn a humorous situation and make it something horrific. So.
Questions?
Okay, let's see.
We're all busily inspecting the Q&A.
Yes.
We're not ignoring it. We are reading it.
Yeah, we're reading it. We're reading it. And yes, I would say auditors are definitely bureaucrats.
That's it. Auditors are kind of the worst because they're accountants and bureaucrats.
Yeah, or forensic. In a sense, they're forensic accountants because they are looking over everything to see what went wrong. And if they do their job rightly or wrongly, they will find things you didn't know were wrong.
Yeah, I found myself in the company of generally those people in the private sector who are in charge of making sure the rest of the company is not keeping them out of trouble, which is often thankless because you're not generating any revenue, but you're also the ones keeping everyone, like I said, out of trouble and keeping all the regulatory agencies away from the door.
Oh yeah, that is a big job of bureaucracy, is to keep the whole organization, whether it be a corporation or a government organization, out of trouble. And boy, you do that and they hate you, and the person you're stopping hates you for life. That's why whistleblowers are always at risk, because showing the world that something's wrong here, or even just showing the organization that something's wrong there. I once basically stopped an over expenditure of $14 million in 1 year. I had to hide the fact that that was me who stopped it, because the person who did it was gunning for me, because 5 years earlier, I had made sure that a procurement went to somebody whose price was $50,000 versus the contractor whose price was close to $1 million for proprietary software for a website. And the bureaucrat never, ever forgave me. And I knew that if I did that, I could not be shown to actually and effectively do my job to save the taxpayers' money. If she had known that, I would have been out in the street. So yeah, you're never, ever, nobody's ever going to thank you for doing your job right.
Unless it comes out in your favor, because that's how, that's what you were trying for.
It came out in my favor in both cases, but just by doing it right, there was the group that was going, yay, Jean Marie. And there was the group that was the individual who became an SES, Senior Executive Service. For those of you who are not in the government, the civil service equivalent of a general has to be approved by Congress. The other individual had become an SES, and she would have used the regs to kill my career.
Yeah.
So yeah, you may have fans, but that doesn't make mean that you're going to be thanked for it.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean you won't have enemies as well.
Yeah. Well, isn't the quality of a person judged by the nature of their enemies?
But that's another great place, getting sort of circling back to our writing discussion, where if some bureaucrat is out to get you, that's an awful lot of obstacles to throw in a character's way that can make things much more interesting for that character. If you're stuck and you're like, they need to have some kind of trouble thrown at them. Oh, look, here's the local tax collector or whatever that doesn't like them anymore and is going to crack down on their shop or their business or their livelihood or their, house. We have local code enforcement that comes out with a little ruler and tells us how tall our grass can be.
Yep.
It's like,
Yep.
oh, gee, you just came into all this gold. We'll have to, we have a tax on that kind of thing around here.
Or your magical bar appeared out of nowhere, the Gilgamesh bar in the Bar series by Zombies Need Brains. Your magical bar is hopping from city to city. Don't tell me a tax inspector didn't show up with a notice. I know they did.
What I was thinking as you guys were speaking, if you're so when you're writing, if you're writing a character who's in bureaucracy, and you want to add some pressure, you could have them find out that they're being investigated by the Office of Internal Investigations. Like city governments have those, federal governments have those. I guess the GSA would qualify for the federal.
Could be GSA, could be the GAO.
Yeah, that's the one I was thinking of.
Government auditing organization, but every organization has its own internal watchdog.
And then also another point for like if you're looking at trade for marketplaces and things, you could think about export compliance. Like those, are there like requirements for what your characters are allowed to take with them or bring into wherever port they're going to, or if in the bar that's hopping around, like, are there certain alcohols that are not allowed to be in that bar in certain areas?
Yeah. Oh yeah. There are so many options there. And then you've got the whole thing where you've got these pockets that are almost like the places of holding. I'm fascinated and I want to learn more about these various lockers that are in various airports around the world, where the lockers or the storage facility is its own entity and apart from the country that it's in. And a lot of times things like contraband art are stored in these lockers indefinitely.
The locker space is considered outside the country. So you can put things in there while you're in country that aren't that you don't want looked at and aren't legal. So yeah, okay.
Yeah, and so you've got these pockets that are run by their own bureaucracy, but they are not, you cannot be touched by the bureaucracy of the law-abiding country. I mean, this is the dodge that the Catholic Church, and even today, but other churches, but over history, the Catholic Church used that to protect murderous priests or otherwise criminal priests. Oh no, you can't punish our people. That's on us entirely. And they didn't get punished usually.
Speaking of bureaucracies.
Oh yeah. The original, right up there with Rome, because it's obviously a descendant of the bureaucracy of Rome, and China, you know?
Well, and I think Doc said something earlier about Byzantine, and I was thinking, well, there's a bureaucracy for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Arcady Martine would probably have a lot to say on that one.
I've been staring at a particular question from Judy about how bureaucracies are presented differently in different cultures. And I know we're running out of time, but I'd like to spend a little bit to talk about it. I mean, we we think a lot about people just, enforcing rules, and we feel like the person we have to deal with is the who's telling us what we have to do is the person enforcing the rules. Odds are they really would like to help you because it gets you out of their way and lets them go on to do other things. But it's somebody else above them, that there's a hierarchy where they're being forced to deal with certain things. The British bureaucracies definitely got a different feel to it in terms of it's just, fill this out. The paper keeps moving. Nobody pays attention to what it's trying to do. As long as the forms are filled out, the process goes on. And then there's some places where it's like, this paperwork will be stopped forever unless you happen to have a few coins you can leave on the counter, type thing. I'm sure there's other examples. A lot of it's the flavor of the culture that's implementing the bureaucracy.
If you think about someplace like ancient China, where there's a whole hierarchy of a whole class of people whose job it is to be professional bureaucrats.
Mm-hmm.
And they studied for years for that privilege, and it was considered a privilege because that's how you got money, power that you could pass on to your children, as well as comfort in your life, assuming you didn't piss off your superiors.
Yeah, it's one of it's
Always
one
an
of those
assumption.
early societies where you could actually possibly move up.
Yeah.
And increase your status by going through that.
Got 2 minutes.
As just thinking about medieval society, where it's like you went to court because the noble there could decide anything. It's like that was the source of, did you get justice? Did you get executed? Was however that person was feeling today.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I guess we're getting near towards the end. Our tech here is telling us maybe wind it up and just have everyone talk about anything they just want to say finally, if they want to promote anything they have. All I have is I'm doing trivia, so if you go to the federal room actually at 10 o'clock the next tonight, the next 2 nights, so look for the trivia breakout room and I'll be in that. So anyone else have any final thoughts or any final promotions they want to do?
Well, bureaucracy can be both your friend and your enemy in real life, as well as on the page. And if you want to see where I've used it in my fiction, check out the stuff at JeanMarieWard.com. Thanks for letting me be here and play in your sandbox, Brick. And it's great seeing everybody else.
I'll go. I'm as an acquiring editor for the Dread Machine. We have a submission call. It is a pro-paying submission call for stories that touch on the themes of identity, security, and/or community. It closes this Monday at 11:59 p.m. EST. Pay is 8 cents a word, and you can find me for more information or just search for Darkness Blooms Anthology.
Beth, you want to go next?
Sure. I don't have anything coming out right away, but people can find me on Twitter at BT Musings, and I'll put that in the chat.
All right, and I'm Doc Coleman. I write steampunk comedy adventure. Not a lot of bureaucracy in it currently, but if you're interested, check out doccoleman.com or go to Amazon and search for Doc Coleman Steampunk. I want to say that it's been an interesting panel, interesting questions from the audience, and sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but looks like you've had a good discussion on your own.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. And the discussion, if you're interested, will continue in Discord. I think we did water table. Is that right? The water table.
Yep, we're the water table
Discord.
room.
Water table room in Discord. So again, thank you, everyone, and thank you for coming. Thank you all the panelists and the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.